When I came home from school, I saw no one was home, just a note on the table. Cat food in the jar. Don't forget to take out the trash. We'll be back in 2 weeks. After what I did later, they deeply regretted treating me that way. My name's Sam, and I've been living with my Aunt Marlena since my parents died 3 years ago. Everyone thinks she took me in out of the goodness of her heart. But let me tell you the truth nobody wants to hear. She did it for the monthly check. Every conversation about me in that house revolved around what the state was paying her for my care. Food stamps, housing assistance, the whole 9 yards. I wasn't her nephew. I was her meal ticket. The worst part? She made sure I knew it every single day. While her biological kids got new clothes for school, I was hitting up Goodwill with my own money. While they got allowances for chores, I was working actual jobs just to buy deodorant and soap. Been grinding since I was 14, stocking shelves at the corner store after school, just to have basic human necessities. The house always felt like I was renting a room from strangers who barely tolerated me. Aunt Marlena's husband would give me these looks like I was some kind of burden they couldn't shake. Their kids, my so-called cousins, treated me like the weird kid who crashed their family party and never left. You know what really gets to me? The way they'd talk about family stuff right in front of me like I wasn't even there. Planning birthday parties, discussing Christmas gifts, organizing weekend trips, all while I'm sitting at the same kitchen table, completely invisible. But the day that really opened my eyes happened on a Tuesday in October. I remember because I had just finished an 8-hour shift at the local flea market, hauling furniture and boxes of junk for vendors. My back was killing me. My hands were covered in dust and splinters, and all I wanted was to grab some leftover pizza and crash. I walked up to our little ranch house, expecting the usual chaos. TV blaring, kids arguing, Aunt Marlena yelling at someone about something. Instead, I found complete silence. The driveway was empty except for my beat-up bicycle. Now, in most normal families, someone might give you a heads up if the whole crew was disappearing for a while. Maybe a text, a note on the fridge, something. But walking into that kitchen, all I found was a crumpled piece of paper next to an empty cat food bowl. The note was written in Aunt Marlena's chicken scratch handwriting. No Dear Sam, or anything remotely personal. Just straight to the point. Cat food is in the pantry. Don't forget to take out the trash. We'll be back in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. They packed up the whole family. Aunt Marlena, her husband, and all 4 of their kids, and drove down to Florida for what I assumed was some kind of vacation. Nobody thought to mention this little family getaway to the guy who'd been living under the same roof for 3 years. I stood there holding that note, and something just clicked. This wasn't forgetfulness or poor communication. This was them treating me exactly like what I was to them. The help. You don't invite the hired help on family vacations. You leave them instructions and expect them to keep the house running. The cat, a fat orange tabby named Butterscotch that barely acknowledged my existence, wandered into the kitchen and started meowing for dinner. Even the cat got more consideration than I did. At least they remembered to tell me to feed it. That first night alone, I sat in the empty living room eating a microwave burrito and watching their big screen TV. Something I usually wasn't allowed to do. The house felt different without them. Bigger, somehow, quieter. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't walking on eggshells. But the quiet also made everything crystal clear. This wasn't my home. It never had been. I was just a live-in maintenance guy who happened to share some DNA with the owner. The realization hit me like a brick wall. I was 17 years old and completely on my own. Days started blending together. Wake up, feed Butterscotch, go to school, work my shift at the flea market, come home to an empty house. Rinse and repeat. No family dinners. No one asking about homework. No fake concern about my day. Just me and a cat who only cared if his food bowl was full. The weird part? I started sleeping better. Without Aunt Marlena's constant criticism or her husband's passive-aggressive comments, I could actually relax. For the first time since moving in, I wasn't bracing myself for the next insult or reminder of how unwanted I was. But sleeping better didn't solve my bigger problems. I was still a minor living alone, technically abandoned by my legal guardian. If the wrong person found out, I could end up in the system, bouncing between foster homes until I aged out. The thought terrified me more than being alone. By the end of the first week, I'd fallen into a routine that actually worked. School during the day, flea market after. The vendors there had started treating me less like a kid and more like a regular employee. Old Pete, who ran the vintage furniture booth, even started letting me help customers when he was busy with other things. Working at that flea market was opening my eyes to a whole different world. Every day, people would bring in boxes of stuff they considered worthless, and somehow Pete and the other vendors would find treasures hidden in the junk. Made me wonder what other people overlooked or threw away too quickly. One evening, while heating up another sad microwave dinner, I caught myself actually enjoying the silence. No TV blaring, no kids fighting, no adults complaining about bills or work or how much trouble teenagers are. Just me, butterscotch, and the sound of my own thoughts for once. That's when it hit me. Maybe this abandonment thing wasn't the worst thing that could happen to me. Maybe it was exactly what I needed. For the first time in years, I could think clearly about what I actually wanted from life, instead of just trying to survive each day in a house where I wasn't wanted. Working at Murphy's Flea Market wasn't exactly what you put on a college application, but it was honest work and it paid cash. The place was basically a giant warehouse where people brought their unwanted junk and somehow turned it into other people's treasures. My job? I was a muscle, loading trucks, moving furniture, hauling boxes of random stuff from storage to the vendor booths. The other workers there had this running joke about me that got old real fast. Every time I'd show up for my shift, someone would make the same crack about how I belonged there. Big Tony, the loading dock supervisor, loved reminding me that I was basically living like the junk we sorted through. He'd point at a pile of broken furniture or water-damaged boxes and laugh about how that's where kids like me end up. The other guys would join in, making comments about how maybe I should just set up a tent in the back corner and make it official. The worst part wasn't the jokes. It was how they said it like they were doing me some kind of favor by stating the obvious. Like, yeah, I got it. I was the kid with holes in his shoes working for minimum wage while everyone else went home to actual families who cared about them. But here's the thing about working around other people's discarded stuff all day. You start developing an eye for what's valuable and what's actually worthless. While the other workers were focused on making fun of me, I was paying attention to what the dealers were looking for. Old Pete from the vintage booth taught me more in 3 months than I'd learned in 3 years of high school. He showed me how to spot real wood versus particle board, how to identify different types of metal, and most importantly, how to recognize when something was way older and more valuable than it looked. The day everything changed started like any other. I rolled up to Murphy's on my bike, locked it to the fence, and clocked in for another 8-hour shift of being everyone's favorite punching bag. The delivery truck had just dropped off 3 estates worth of stuff. Basically everything from 3 different houses where people had either died or moved to nursing homes. My job was to sort through it all and organize it into categories. Furniture in one section, books in another, kitchen stuff over there, random household items in the catch-all area. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Outdated electronics, clothes that smell like mothballs, and furniture that had seen better decades. But buried in the third estate lot, underneath a stack of moldy National Geographic magazines from the 70s, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a small, worn leather case, about the size of a paperback book, but thicker. The leather was cracked and faded, but the brass hinges still worked. Inside, nestled in what used to be red velvet lining, was a pair of round wire-rimmed glasses. They looked ancient, but not in a cheap costume jewelry way. These had weight to them, real craftsmanship, and engraved on the inside of one of the temples, in tiny precise letters, were the initials TA. Now, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I pay attention in history class. And something about those initials, combined with how old these glasses looked, made my heart start beating a little faster. I closed the case and slipped it into my backpack, without saying anything to anyone. The rest of my shift dragged on forever. Every time someone made their usual jokes about me living in the dumpster, I just nodded and kept working. But inside, I was practically vibrating with this weird combination of excitement and terror. What if these were actually worth something? What if I was completely wrong, and they were just some random old guys reading glasses? That evening, I rode my bike straight to the public library instead of going home to the empty house. The librarian, Mrs. Chun, had always been nice to me, probably because I was one of the few teenagers who actually used the place for research instead of just playing games on computers. I spent 3 hours going through everything I could find about famous Americans with the initials T.A. Thomas Alva Edison kept coming up, and the more I read about him, the more convinced I became that I might be holding something incredible. Edison was basically the Steve Jobs of his era, the guy who invented the light bulb, the phonograph, motion pictures, and about 1,000 other things that changed the world. He was also famous for having really distinctive round glasses that he wore in almost every photograph from his later years. I pulled out my phone and started comparing pictures of Edison, wearing his glasses, to the ones I'd found. The shape was right. The wire rims looked identical. Even the way they sat seemed to match. Walking home that night, I felt like I was carrying a winning lottery ticket that might turn out to be a fake. The smart thing would have been to show them to Pete or one of the other vendors who actually knew about antiques. But something held me back. Maybe it was 3 years of having everything taken away from me, or maybe I just needed to be absolutely sure before I trusted anyone else with this information. Back at the empty house, I sat at the kitchen table with the glasses case open in front of me, just staring at them under the overhead light. Butterscotch jumped up on the table and sniffed at the case, then wandered off like even he knew this was bigger than his usual concerns about food and naps. The next morning at work, I couldn't focus on anything. Every joke about me belonging in the dumpster felt different now. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was exactly where I belonged. Not because I was worthless, but because I was the only one paying attention to what everyone else was throwing away. During my lunch break, I called the local antique shop downtown. The owner, Mr. Rodriguez, had been dealing with vintage items for 30 years. Without mentioning what I had, I asked him about the process of authenticating historical items. He explained about provenance, expert verification, and how auction houses handled potentially valuable pieces. That conversation gave me the confidence to take the next step. After work, instead of going home, I rode my bike downtown to Rodriguez's shop. The place was cramped and dusty, filled with furniture, jewelry, and random collectibles that looked like they'd been there since the shop opened. Mr. Rodriguez looked like he'd stepped out of a different era himself. Thin white mustache, wire-rimmed glasses, not unlike the ones in my backpack, and a vest that had probably been fashionable sometime in the 1980s. When I walked in, he was hunched over a magnifying glass, examining what looked like an old pocket watch. I waited until he finished with the watch, then cleared my throat. He looked up with the expression of someone who was used to kids bringing in junk they thought was treasure. I carefully pulled out the leather case and set it on his counter. The moment he opened it and saw those glasses, his whole demeanor changed. He got very quiet, very focused. He picked them up carefully, examined them under different lights, and spent almost 10 minutes just looking at every detail. Finally, he set them down and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, like I was someone worth taking seriously. The next words out of his mouth would either change my life forever or crush the only hope I'd had in years. Mr. Rodriguez set those glasses down like they were made of pure gold, which honestly, they might as well have been based on the look in his eyes. He reached under his counter and pulled out the serious-looking magnifying glass setup, the kind you see jewelers use in movies when they're examining diamonds. For the next 20 minutes, he examined every millimeter of those glasses, the frame, the lenses, the hinges, even the screws. He kept making these little humming sounds, the kind people make when they're trying not to get too excited about something. Finally, he took off his own glasses, rubbed his eyes, and looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. The silence in that shop was killing me. Outside, I could hear cars driving by, people living their normal lives, completely unaware that my entire future was being decided by this old guy with a magnifying glass. He put the glasses back in their case very carefully, then walked over to his computer. For the next 10 minutes, he was typing, clicking, comparing photos on his screen to the glasses in front of him. I stood there trying to act casual, but inside, I was freaking out. When he finally turned back to me, he had this expression that was part excitement, part disbelief, and part something else I couldn't quite read. He asked me where I'd found them, and I told him the truth about the estate sale items at the flea market. He nodded slowly, like that made sense to him. Then he said the words that changed everything. These were almost certainly authentic Thomas Edison glasses, complete with his distinctive engraving style and the exact specifications that matched historical records of his personal eyewear. The wear patterns, the metal composition, even the type of glass used in the lenses, everything checked out. But here's where it gets really crazy. Mr. Rodriguez explained that Edison items, especially personal items like his glasses, were incredibly rare at auction. Most of the stuff was either museums or held by collectors who never sold. When pieces like this did show up, they commanded serious money. He pulled up some recent auction results on his computer. A letter written by Edison had sold for $50,000. A prototype phonograph part went for over $100,000. But personal items, things he actually wore or used daily, those were in a completely different category. My hands were literally shaking as he showed me the numbers. He suggested I contact a major auction house in New York, specifically one that specialized in historical American artifacts. He even offered to make some calls for me to authenticate my story and help establish provenance. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and express mail packages. The auction house wanted detailed photographs, a written account of where I'd found the glasses, and documentation of everything I could remember about the estate lot they came from. 3 weeks later, I got a call that I'll remember for the rest of my life. The authentication team had completed their analysis. Not only were the glasses authentic, but they could trace their ownership history back to Edison's estate sale in 1931. Somehow, they'd passed through several private collections over the decades before ending up in some random person's house, forgotten in a drawer. The auction house representative explained that based on recent sales of similar Edison personal items, they estimated the glasses would sell for anywhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million. I had to ask her to repeat that number 3 times before my brain could process it. They scheduled the auction for 6 weeks out, giving them time to properly catalog the item and generate interest among serious collectors. During that time, I had to keep going to school, keep working at the flea market, and somehow act like my entire life hadn't just been turned upside down. The hardest part was keeping it secret. Every day at work, listening to the same jokes about me belonging in the dumpster, knowing that I was sitting on something that would change everything. Big Tony would make his usual cracks about me living like garbage, and I just nod and smile, counting down the days. The auction house sent a specialist to Murphy's Flea Market to document exactly where I'd found the glasses, interview Pete and the other vendors about the estate sale, and photograph the general area. Watching this well-dressed expert treat our dingy warehouse like it was some kind of archaeological site was surreal. Pete was the only person I trusted enough to tell the whole story to. When I showed him the auction house paperwork, he just sat there shaking his head. He'd been working with antiques for 40 years, and he'd never seen anything like this. He kept saying he couldn't believe something that valuable had been sitting right under our noses. The weeks leading up to the auction were torture. I checked the auction house website obsessively, watching as they posted professional photographs of the glasses and detailed descriptions of their historical significance. Seeing them displayed like that, in fancy lighting with museum-quality documentation, made the whole thing feel real for the first time. Meanwhile, at home, I was still living alone in Aunt Marlena's house, feeding Butterscotch and pretending everything was normal. The 2 weeks had stretched into over a month, with no word from Florida about when they were coming back. Part of me hoped they'd just stay there permanently. The night before the auction, I couldn't sleep. I kept doing math in my head, calculating different scenarios. Even if the glasses sold for the low end of the estimate, it would be more money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to finish high school without working. Enough for college. Enough to never have to depend on anyone else ever again. The auction was scheduled for 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and I could watch it live on the auction house website. I skipped school that day, probably the first time I'd ever missed class for something other than work, and sat in the empty house with my laptop, refreshing the page every few minutes. When the bidding started, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. The opening bid was $200,000, which was already more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. But it didn't stop there. Within minutes, the price had jumped to $400,000, then $600,000. Professional collectors and museums were bidding against each other, driving the price higher and higher. I watched the numbers climb on my screen, barely able to breathe. 700,000, 800,000, 900,000. When the final hammer came down, the glasses had sold for $1.1 million. After the auction house took their commission, I was looking at just over $900,000. $900,000 from a pair of glasses I'd found in a pile of junk that everyone else had ignored. I sat there in that empty kitchen, staring at my laptop screen, trying to process what had just happened. Butterscotch jumped up on the table and knocked over my water glass, snapping me back to reality. This was real. This was actually happening. The first thing I did was call Mr. Rodriguez to thank him. The second thing I did was call Pete at the flea market to let him know I wouldn't be coming in for my shift. And the third thing I did was start planning how I was going to handle Aunt Marlena when she eventually came home and found out what I'd been hiding. 3 days after the auction, my phone rang at 7 a.m. I was still getting used to the idea that I didn't have to set an alarm anymore, didn't have to drag myself to the flea market, didn't have to count every dollar just to buy lunch. But that early morning call snapped me right back to reality. It was Aunt Marlena calling from Florida, and she sounded different. Not her usual annoyed, put-upon tone, but something almost excited. She'd heard from someone back home about some kid from the flea market who'd found something valuable. Small towns love gossip, especially when it involves money. She started off casual, asking how I was doing, if I was keeping up with school, the usual fake concern she'd never shown before. But I could hear something underneath it, this barely contained energy that told me she already knew exactly why she was calling. Then she got to the point. She'd heard rumors about me finding some old glasses that sold for a lot of money. Was that true? And if it was, she hoped I remembered who had taken care of me all these years when I had nothing and nobody else. I could have lied, could have told her it was just rumors, that I hadn't found anything valuable. But something about sitting in that empty house, looking around at 3 years of being treated like an unwanted burden, made me tell her the truth. Yes, I found Edison's glasses. Yes, they'd sold at auction for over $1 million. And yes, I now had more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an hour. Then she exploded, not with anger, but with this weird combination of excitement and immediate entitlement that made my stomach turn. She started talking about how she'd raised me, how she'd given me a roof over my head when I had nowhere else to go, how she'd fed me and clothed me and made sure I had everything I needed. She conveniently forgot to mention the monthly checks she'd been cashing for my care, or the fact that I'd been buying my own food and clothes for years. But the worst part was when she said it, the thing that made everything crystal clear. She told me that family takes care of family. And now that I had money, it was time for me to step up and take care of the people who had taken care of me. She started talking about percentages, about how much I owed them for 3 years of housing and food. I listened to her lay out her expectations like she was negotiating a business deal. The house needed a new roof. Her husband's truck was on its last legs. The kids needed money for college. And here I was, sitting on almost $1 million that I never would have had if she hadn't given me a place to live. When she finished her pitch, she asked what I thought was fair. Like this was some kind of reasonable conversation between equals, instead of the woman who'd left me alone for over a month with nothing but a note about feeding the cat. I told her I needed time to think about it. That seemed to satisfy her for the moment, and we hung up with her reminding me that family is the most important thing, and that she'd always been there for me when I needed her most. The next few days, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Aunt Marlena called twice a day, each time with a new sob story about their financial struggles. Her husband called to man me about responsibility and family loyalty. Even the cousins who barely acknowledged my existence for 3 years suddenly wanted to chat about old times and how much they'd missed having me around. But the call that really got to me came from my youngest cousin, Emma. She was only 12, and unlike the rest of her family, she'd always been decent to me. She called crying, saying her mom had told her that I was rich now, but didn't want to help the family anymore. That's when I realized what was happening. Aunt Marlena wasn't just pressuring me. She was manipulating the whole family, making me out to be the selfish villain who was abandoning the people who'd saved him. She was rewriting history, turning herself into the generous saint who'd sacrificed for the ungrateful orphan. I started getting calls from neighbors, family friends, even people from church I barely knew. Somehow, word had gotten around that I was refusing to help my poor aunt who'd raised me out of the goodness of her heart. The story had been twisted so thoroughly that I was a bad guy in my own life. The breaking point came when I got a call from Mrs. Patterson, my old elementary school teacher. She'd heard the story third hand and wanted to talk to me about gratitude and responsibility. Listening to this woman who'd known me since I was 8 years old lecture me about owing my aunt money was more than I could take. That night, I made a decision. I called Aunt Marlena back and told her I was willing to discuss helping the family financially. She was so excited she could barely contain herself. She started making plans, talking about amounts, suggesting we could work out some kind of monthly payment system. Then I told her my condition. I wanted the whole family to come home from Florida so we could sit down together and have an honest conversation about our relationship over the past 3 years. I wanted to discuss not just what I might owe them, but what they owed me. 3 years of emotional support, encouragement, and basic human decency that had been missing from my life. The excitement in her voice died immediately. She started backtracking, saying they couldn't cut their vacation short, that we could handle this over the phone, that there was no need to make things complicated with a big family meeting. But I stood firm. If we were going to talk about family obligations and what we owed each other, then we were going to have that conversation face to face, with everyone present. Otherwise, they could stay in Florida as long as they wanted, and I'd make my own decisions about my money. She hung up angry, and I didn't hear from anyone in the family for 2 days. Then, suddenly I got a text message that changed everything. They were coming home early. They'd be back in 3 days, and we could have our family meeting. I spent those 3 days preparing for the most important conversation of my life. I wrote down everything I wanted to say, all the ways they'd made me feel unwanted and invisible over the past 3 years. I gathered documentation of all the money I'd spent on my own necessities, all the times I'd been excluded from family activities, all the evidence of how I'd been treated like hired help rather than family. But most importantly, I prepared myself mentally for what I was about to do, because I'd already made my decision about the money, and I knew it wasn't going to make anyone happy except me. The night before they were supposed to arrive, I sat in that quiet house one last time, eating a microwave dinner and feeding butterscotch, knowing that everything was about to change again. But this time, I was the one calling the shots. They rolled into the driveway on a Thursday afternoon, their SUV packed with Florida souvenirs and that tan, relaxed look people get from a month of vacation. But I could see the tension in Aunt Marlena's face as she got out of the car. This wasn't the homecoming she planned. I watched from the kitchen window as they unloaded their bags, the kids complaining about having to leave Disney World early, her husband shooting glances at the house like he was seeing it differently now that it might contain someone with serious money. The family meeting happened that evening around the same kitchen table where I'd eaten countless silent dinners, feeling invisible and unwanted. But everything was different now. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and we all knew it. Aunt Marlena started with her prepared speech about family loyalty and gratitude. She talked about the sacrifices she'd made, taking in a troubled teenager when she already had 4 kids of her own. She mentioned the extra groceries, the utilities, the wear and tear on the house from having an additional person. I let her finish. Then I opened a notebook I prepared and started reading my own list. 3 years of buying my own school supplies, clothes, toiletries. 3 years of working after school, while her kids got allowances for basic chores. 3 years of being excluded from family dinners, vacations, and holidays. Most importantly, I talked about the month they'd just spent in Florida, without even telling me they were leaving. How they'd treated me like a house sitter rather than a family member. How I'd realized, sitting alone in this house, that I'd never actually been part of their family at all. The room got very quiet. Her husband started to say something about me being ungrateful, but Aunt Marlena cut him off. She could see where this was going, and she didn't like it. Then I told him about my decision. I'd already started looking for my own apartment. I was going to finish high school independently, maybe get my GED early and start college. I was going to build my own life with my own money, without depending on anyone who saw me as a burden. That's when the real Aunt Marlena came out. The fake concern disappeared, replaced by pure fury. She started yelling about how I was just a selfish kid who'd gotten lucky, how I'd never have found those glasses if she hadn't given me a place to live. She demanded to know what I thought I owed her for 3 years of housing and food. I looked at her across that table, this woman who'd made me feel worthless for so long, and I gave her my final answer, based on the monthly payment she'd been receiving from the state for my care. Minus what I'd actually cost her in groceries and utilities, she actually owed me money. The calculation was simple math that I'd worked out with a social worker I contacted. Foster care payments, food stamps, tax deductions for having a dependent. She'd been making a profit on my presence in her house for 3 years. Meanwhile, I'd been working and buying my own necessities like I was a tenant paying rent. She exploded, started screaming about how ungrateful I was, how she'd wasted 3 years of her life on someone who didn't appreciate anything. Her husband joined in, saying I was just another deadbeat teenager who thought the world owed him something. But here's the thing about having financial independence. It gives you the freedom to walk away from toxic people. I stood up from that table, looked at each of them, and delivered the speech I'd been rehearsing for days. I told them they were right about one thing. I had gotten lucky. But luck only matters if you're paying attention, and I'd learned to pay attention by being ignored and undervalued for so long. I'd found something valuable because I'd been forced to see value in places other people overlooked. Then I told Aunt Marlena exactly what I thought our relationship had been worth. Every month, she'd cash a check for taking care of me. Every month, I provided free labor around the house and asked for nothing in return. We were even, as far as I was concerned. The kids were staring at me like they'd never seen me before. For 3 years, I'd been the quiet, invisible cousin who did chores and stayed out of the way. Now I was the guy telling their parents exactly what I thought how they'd treated me. Aunt Marlena made one last attempt to guilt me into sharing the money. She brought up my parents, said they would have wanted me to take care of family, that they'd be disappointed in how selfish I'd become. That crossed a line I didn't even know I had. I told her that my parents had left me with someone they trusted to love and protect me, not someone who would see me as a monthly paycheck, and that if they could see how she'd treated me for 3 years, they'd be proud of me for finally standing up for myself. The conversation ended with Aunt Marlena giving me an ultimatum. Either I started contributing significantly to the household expenses, or I could find somewhere else to live. She expected an answer by the weekend. I gave her my answer right then and there. I'd be out by Sunday. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of apartment hunting, paperwork, and shopping for basic furniture. I found a decent one-bedroom place about 20 minutes from school, close enough to walk to a part-time job if I wanted one. Far enough from Aunt Marlena's house that I'd never have to see any of them again unless I chose to. Moving day was surreal. 3 years of living in that house, and everything I actually owned fit in the back of a pickup truck I'd rented for the day. Clothes, books, my laptop, and a few personal items that had belonged to my parents. That was it. Aunt Marlena watched from the kitchen window as I loaded my stuff. She didn't come outside, didn't say goodbye, didn't acknowledge that I was leaving. Her husband and the kids stayed inside, too. After 3 years of being treated like I was invisible, I was finally actually disappearing from their lives. The only one who seemed to care was Butterscotch. That fat orange cat followed me out to the truck and sat there meowing like he couldn't understand why his food provider was leaving. I almost felt bad for him, but not bad enough to stay. 6 months later, I'm finishing my senior year as an independent student. I bought a reliable car, furnished my apartment with actual new furniture instead of hand-me-downs, and started taking college prep courses. I even hired a tutor for calculus, something that would have been impossible when I was working every afternoon just to buy soap and deodorant. But the best part isn't the money or the independence. It's the silence. No more jokes about belonging in a dumpster. No more passive-aggressive comments about being grateful for scraps. No more pretending to be part of a family that never wanted me there in the first place. I had long dreamed of owning my own business, and finally, I opened a small electronics repair shop. At first, it was tough. There weren't many customers and expenses were high, but over time my reputation started to grow. People began coming more often, and I improved my skills and expanded the range of services. Now the business is gradually developing, and I'm earning a steady income that not only covers expenses, but also lets me plan for growth. Thanks for sticking with this crazy story of how I went from being treated like garbage to finding actual treasure in the garbage. I know it sounds too wild to be true, but sometimes life really does work out like a movie. What do you think? Was I right to cut ties with my aunt's family, or should I have shared the money? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow, and I've got more unbelievable life stories to share with you all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.